Under a moon the color of old iron, a child from another world lifts the night like a sheet of glass and shatters the spreading darkness with a single, impossible stillness, an act that saves a valley and tears a thread in a fate older than the rings, binding her to power she scarcely understands. The road beneath her boots was crusted with frost, and the edge of the wood breathed as if the trees themselves exhaled shadow. The air tasted of cold iron and distant pine. It smelled of the sea when salt grows thin and bitter with distance. A rift had opened behind her, raw and humming, a seam where air did not obey the sky. From that seam she had walked, alone and small, carrying nothing but the pressure of something fierce and young within her head. The rangers had come to the pass in a tight, moving line, their cloaks like a row of darker leaves against the snow. They moved with the soft confidence of those who have known peril on lonely roads, and their blades sang faint notes against scabbards. One of them, a man with a face carved by wind, held a torch that made a pale circle of honest flame. Their leader, tall, with a voice that fell low like well-kept soil, spoke no name at first. He spoke instead with a hand, slow and flat, to make halt. The company halted, and the wood did not answer. Shadow moved then in a manner not of wind, but of will. It pooled at the trunks and slid like oil across the path. At first, it might have been mistaken for night, wearing a new mood. But the shadows had edges and a crawling heat. Fingers, many and hair thin, reached. They sought the throat of the torchbearer and the ungloved wrist of a younger man who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and home. The rangers' horses stamped and whickered, ears pressed to their skulls, and a cold so deep pressed at the teeth. One of the younger rangers tried to light another flame with a spark from flint and failed, as if the light itself had become shy. The leader's jaw hardened. He moved as a shield rather than a sword, putting himself between his men and the dark. The child stepped forward then, and the hush was not the hush of fear, but of something older. She was not tall, she was not armored. Her hair clung with frost at her temples. The rift behind her bled a smell like copper and ozone around her. The edges of that seam still hummed with the aftertaste of a distant thunder. She did not carry a torch. Her palms were bare and faintly pink with the cold. Her eyes, when they turned to meet the leaders, were not those of a child staring in awe, nor those of a veteran eyeing a threat. They were like glass that has learned to hold a storm. The shadow reached. It was as if night had grown teeth, not seeking to make a wound so much as to silence the sense of being. Tendrils wound toward sound and warmth, coaxing, testing. The torch's flame faltered. A cooler, darker wind moved like a thought across the road, and the rangers felt their names slip from memory. One of them, a lantern holder with a scar on his lip, staggered and put both hands to his head as if some long remembrance had been forced back on him. The leader gripped the hilt of his sword until the knuckles hurt, and the torchlight carved his gaunt features into a map of decisions. She raised no blade. No chords of incantation shaped her lips. The movement she made was small, like the breathing in before a bell rings. For a moment, the air seemed to listen. The rangers felt at first as pressure, not wind, a pushing within the bones, the sense that some old geometry had been altered. The child did not speak aloud, yet the trees shivered as if called by name. The nearest tendril of shadow recoiled as though struck by a cold fire. The hush that had perched on the company dissolved into a sound like glass cracking in slow motion. Then came the stillness. It was the absence of all the little noises that let you know you are alive. The creak of leather, the rattle of chain, a horse's breath. In that impossible quiet, her power became an act of hands without moving. The darkness yielded to her thought as if it were thread. She shaped it, condensed it, held it fast. With a single, supreme intention, she lifted that folded night and hurled it. The shadow answered as a sheet might answer a thrown stone, and it shattered. Shards of night flew outward like feathers of coal. They sprayed the road with a sound that was almost musical. Hard, brittle notes that rang against the trunks and rang into the skulls of men. Some pieces dissolved, evaporating into a glitter that smelled faintly of ozone. Others found the trunks and the earth and held, smoking a little where they landed. The torch flared as if a breath of a larger hearth had found it, and light spilled over faces rendered pale and astonished. The leader staggered back, palms raised to shield himself from a brightness that was not entirely flame. The younger men dropped to knees and laughed wet and unbelieving laughs. One of them said, hoarse and thin with swallowed fear, "By Elbereth," though his voice was more prayer than invocation. The clearing she had made was not wide, but it was perfect enough. The rangers stepped into that spare geometry as if into a ship that could move through waves. Their footsteps sounded brave and small. They set their backs to the trees and formed a pocket of fire and steel around the child. She stood at the center, hands trembling now, the aftertaste of power thick on her tongue. She had not looked away from the rift that still pulsed like a wounded thing. In the sky above the wood, where the moon looked like a burned coin, there was now a mark, small and terrible and bright. It rose like a sigil seared into cloud. At first it was only a burnished line, a white-black slash across the moonless part of the heavens. Then the line opened into a shape that made the hair at the ranger's napes prick. It was not a language they knew, but it had the stern logic of an old rune. It hummed in a register so low, the horses shied. Even the trees held their breath. The child saw it too. Her face lost the child's softness and sharpened as though some bell had been rung inside her chest. Her fingers dug crescent marks into the frost. For one instant she might have smiled, or else the cold creases of her mouth made something that looked like a smile. Then she swallowed, and the look left her. The ranger's leader stepped close, his face raw and uncertain. He did not unmask the child's mystery with questions. He only asked for the immediate truth. "From whence came you, little one?" His voice was roughened by authority and unpracticed tenderness. She did not answer with words. She lifted one hand toward the sigil and felt its echo like a pull in the marrow of her bones. The mark above had not come from the rift alone. It had been written by the force of her act, a burning left where the night had been gathered and snapped. That brand of night was no mere shadow. It was a notice, a bell calling. A taste of iron flushed the air, and where the sigil cupped the moon's dull face, a small cold light bled downward like a second dawn. The wood that had seemed only to breathe now began to move with a deliberateness that made the ranger's feet go still. One of them whispered, and his whisper spread like a contagion of dread. "Watcher," he said. The word was small and old. It had the texture of a thing kept in silence. The leader's eyes narrowed, drawing lines of memory that had been taught to his kind, stories by the fire of leaves that fell and of something that watches longer than men live, from the blackened sky that Mark did not melt but widened, and with that widening came a pressure that was not wind but the weight of being seen. The sense was not of an eye looking with hunger, but of an instrument cataloging, of an awareness that had patience for aeons. The child felt it like a tug at the place where her rift had been sewn to her bones. Her breath quickened. Her power, raw as it was, answered as if to a call long known. She could have closed her hands and pulled the little dawn down again and hidden the sigil. The moment trembled on the edge of that choice. Around them, the pack of rangers shifted as one animal might shift under threat. Torches leaned. Steel was drawn half from scabbard in gestures that were more ritual than preparation. The younger ones glanced toward the rift and then up at the burning sign, and in their faces was a sudden electric mingling of wonder and fear. The child took another small step forward, and though none of the men bade her, they parted to let her through. Her hand found the leader's sleeve for a second, and his fingers closed over it. Brief, steady, like a clasp to say, "Stand." A sound like a bell buried under ice began to come from the direction of the rift, the first voice of something responding. It thrummed against teeth and bone and against the careful steadiness the leader wore. The watcher above had been stirred. Whatever long patience kept it in its stone sleep was cracking. The child looked up, pupils wide, and the rangers saw in that gaze the fragile and terrible truth. She had not come by accident, and she had not yet learned the price of what she could do. They moved then, not away but forward. The company tightened like a wound. The leader pointed along the pass with a certainty that felt more command than plan. At his gesture, they would go to the valley ahead, to warn, to gather what few could, to find the dwellings and bell towers and the little mills where the folk might still be asleep. The child did not offer counsel. Her hand, when it closed around the air where the sigil had flared, as if to hold the last of that burned sky within reach. The rift at her back pulsed, and the low bell sound grew louder. Above, the watcher shifted its weight as if to lean, to look again. They moved out as a single dark thread, unspooling down the frost-stiff road toward the valley. None of them spoke the names that had been whispered at fires in older days. None of them yet knew how a child's thought had broken a night. But each felt the new order of things settle about his shoulders like a cloak. The leader's torch cut a steady cone of light. The child walked within it, small and sure, and the marked sky watched, patient and unblinking, while the road took them on. The hum grew teeth. It began as a prickle along a leavened skin, as if the air itself had learned to speak, and then chosen to whistle the syllables of some older tongue. Leaves along the pass stiffened, then sighed, as if listening. A single moth circled and dropped, not dead but hushed, its wing beats swallowed by the new cadence. Her hand was an instrument, and the world a stringboard. When she lifted the small stone, it sang back, not with clink, but with a low, thrumming consonance that braided with whatever lay coiled beneath the dark. The sound stitched itself into the shadow, and the shadow answered, and where sound and shadow met, a tightness appeared, like a knot tied with invisible fingers. The umbral knot, she thought without words, for she had no name to give it, and the name made a small, wrong echo in her mind that tasted of iron and ash. The knot was not simply black. It had weight and direction, as if intent were a thing that could be hefted and turned. When she pushed, it resisted with the stubbornness of old rope. When she pulled, the darkness hunched and pressed back with the cool, patient pressure of a hand closing round a throat. Her telekinesis did not meet emptiness, it met will, an answering will as ancient as the loneliest places, as cold as stone that remembers frost. Every motion she made sent a ripple through that will, and each ripple translated into language the land understood. The grass listened, and bowed branches leaned together as if eavesdropping. Even the sky, pale between the pass fangs, seemed to hold its breath. A sound came then, carried along the bones of the earth before it rode the air. Horse hooves, no, not merely hooves, but the rustle of things that are not warm-blooded, a winter wind disguised in the cadence of riding. It moved through the trees as if the trees were an audience, and the rider yet unseen. The sound multiplied, patient and precise. It carried a hunger that made the hairs along her forearms lift. She had felt hunters before in towns back home, but these footsteps were old hunger, old and formal, like a summons handed down through ages. Something else reacted to that summons. The umbral knot tightened. Threads of shadow uncoiled out of it and set themselves low along the ground like black roots tasting the air. They sought purchase in the soil, in split stone, in small pockets of night where moonlight did not dare to linger. Where the threads brushed, dew receded, and the scent of pine thinned. The weave was learning the timbre of her power. As she moved a pebble, the weave rearranged and attempted to thread itself into the motion, to ride the motion and thereby turn it inward. Her telekinesis was a language the darkness was a dialect. For every sentence she made, it answered with a line that tightened the knot. Her throat made a noise, a caught laugh, or a breathing that might become prayer. She tried a different touch, subtler and more deliberate, as if coaxing a grotto creature from its hole. The tremor that left her fingers was like the edge of a bell. Leaves trembled in counterpoint, then the air took up the note and swelled. A high tone rose, so thin and precise that it seemed to cut the mist itself, but where it brushed the umbral knot, the knot shuddered and multiplied little spines of dark that stabbed outward like the rat tails of a weasel. They did not aim to kill, they aimed to learn. Then came the shadow that had been listening all along. It did not arrive with a body as men or horses do. It rode the hoofbeats like smoke, through gaps between rock and leaf, and the pass itself turned its head toward the sound. The rider, if rider this thing could be called, was a shape that borrowed garments from night. Its cloak drank the light, and its face was a blank keyed to cold. When it drew breath, the air warbled as though a bell were struck in some buried cavern. The creature's presence tasted of lead and of old commands, given and obeyed. Where its cloak brushed the grass, the blades went to gray as if frost had passed where its shadow lay. Even light seemed loath to walk. It heard the new note. It had heard many notes before, but none tuned by a hand that was not of its kin. The umbral knot shivered like a beast smelling a stranger within the fold. The rider reared its mount, and the hooves sounded like winter wind through railings, nearer, nearer. The voice that followed was not made of words so much as of intent. It said, without grammar, that something new had intruded and must be either claimed or snuffed. The air itself tightened around her, a glove closing. 11 felt fingers at the back of her skull, cold and precise. Fingers that were not hands, but comprehension. They did not seek pain. they sought to mark. A presence leaned close, smelling images that were not yet formed in her mind, a presence that wanted to learn the shape of whatever signaled across the weave. It was small, absurdly particular. It wanted the sound she had made to name it, to add it to the atlas of the dark. If the ring wraith, if that was the right word for this hunched, ordered terror she did not know, could name it, it could then pass the name on the wind, and all shadow would be instructed to take it up. She braced. Not in the way soldiers braced, but as a diver steadies before a plunge. Her gift had moved furniture and stopped falling bodies. It had been a polishing of force, a way to shift what was in front of her. Here, she had to do more than move. She had to sing in the key of severance. Her mind reached for a memory of water breaking. Think of glass, she told herself. Think of thin reeds snapping. The hum that had begun as a curiosity became a taut string, and she drew it across with both hands. For a moment, it seemed as if the world paused to listen. Bird song held, the scud of cloud stopped, even the distant mountain inhaled. The umbral knot trembled, a dark pearl on a shaft of night. Spines that had been probing drew back as if stung. The rider's head turned as if surprised at being seen for more than an intent. A whisper ran through the pass, a sound like a name unmade. But the knot did not simply disintegrate. It split, and where it split, it produced smaller knots that tried to stitch themselves to the land like burrs. They were quick silver dark, snapping into the seams of rock and in the crevices of bark. Each morsel knew a different lesson. One remembered how to hide in fog. Another remembered how to listen to the step of booted men. They were not whole, and they were not empty. They were cunning. Her attempt had been a blade, but the dark had 1,000 small threads, and they were ready to graft onto anything. The ring wraith surged forward as if to snatch at the unstitched ends. Its approach was not wild. It moved with a scholar's care, as one who reads through margins to find a ruinous correction. When it reached the nearest curled shadow, it touched it with a fingertip that did not frost, but rather inked. The shadow grew clearer, formed a face, then a shape, then a cold echo of a bone voice. It was building from her note, reshaping the knot into a weapon made of mimicry. It wanted to carry her signature back into the dark and make it a brand. Her arms shook. She felt the strain in places that should not have strain, behind the eyes, in the flat of the palms. Telekinesis had always been work of force in a straight line. This was work of unpicking pattern from pattern. The key, she sensed, lay not in greater force, but in a finer rhythm. The knot answered to will, because will could be woven to unmake it. She could not merely yank at threads. She must change the pattern of weaving itself. She must show the knot a new way for the world to hang together. There was a sound in the wood, no more than the creak of old elm. And then a small, clear note answered her hum. It was not spoken by a living throat. It came from the stone at her boots, from the cold, wet heart of a puddle that had been a well of winter. The note fit the sound the knot feared, an openness, a letting go. Something in her chest loosened at that pitch. She widened her hands not to clutch, but to trace a circle in the air, a slow, deliberate motion like the turning of a key in a lock. The air thickened around the motion it filled with the taste of metal and time. The circle she drew did not strike the knot as a blow. It brushed it as a blade might brush cloth to test its edge. Threads of dark resisted, then slipped, as if by teaching them to glide rather than to grip she had shown them a different stitch. A small portion of the umbral knot softened, as if a burr had come off. The ringwraith recoiled, as if smitten. Its hood fell back a fraction, and for a breath there was a suggestion of something like fury under the cold, and beneath that, a memory of being commanded and obeyed. It had not expected to be refused in the shape it understood. It reared, and the hoofbeats spoke like a decree. Around it, the smaller knots shivered and drew nearer their greater center. They would mend, and they would adapt. 11 could not tell whether she had opened a wound or merely scratched the surface of a deeper seam. She had found a rhythm that unsettled the dark, but the dark had learned the rhythm twice over. The rider was mounting itself with a new purpose. It would not abandon the note it had heard. The pass leaned in, expectant and grave. Her breath clouded before her mouth, a small white thing in the waking chill. She felt the animal part of the world settling into watching, like eyes closing in sleep but not sleeping. She chose then not to hold back, nor to push too hard. She shaped the motion she had found it into something bolder. A ring of force moved outward, not to cleave, but to translate. It would not smash the umbral knot cleanly, it would teach an alternate folding. The wind rose, answering the circular command, and the leaves took up the motion as a chorus. The first contact made the black threads flare like bruised cloth. The rider shrieked, a sound that was all rust and reprimand. The horse stamped, and the hoofbeats became the first hammered beats of an approaching verdict. She sent the ring outward again, stronger, and this time the knotted center hiccuped and spilled a few mote-sized pieces that looked childlike and wrong against the pall. They drifted, small and seed-like, and for one slow, bright second, each held a sliver of light within. Then the light was gone. But the pieces floated free and separate, not tied into the old geometry. They would find new places to be. Some would reknit, some would not. The ringwraith began to run, not toward her, but along the pass with the economy of someone who knows the map. It sought the places to re-anchor the pattern it had tasted. 11 felt the pressure where its intent punched the world. She felt gaps open in the weave. She knew, with a clarity that was almost cruel in its brevity, that whatever she did next would decide whether the pass would be a place that remembered her note as a wound or as a warning to be made right. She set her hands and drew in the old drum of the air. The next motion would not be tentative. She would shape not a circle, but a lattice, fine and precise, the sort of thing that unknits an embroidery instead of tearing its fabric. The Nazgul, the umbral knot, and the black horse all leaned toward that choice like a tide toward shore. The world narrowed to the cold of her palms and the heat of an idea. Teach the dark a different way to tie itself, or never let it tie at all. She willed the pattern into being, and the pass held its breath as the lattice took its first weight. The shattered thing did not go with the wind like smoke. When she let go, the ringwraith broke as if someone had struck night with a fist, and the darkness came apart into a rain of black glass. The pieces sang against stone, thin and terrible, and each shard held a world. Light caught them and turned them into mirrors that showed memory. They spun in the lee of her power and held their images that were not hers and yet belonged to her hand because she had forced them open. She tasted iron and age on her tongue. That taste came from the shards, or from the thing that had been the wraith, or from some deeper place where the One Ring had left its fingerprint on the world. The shards showed not a single face, but a tangle of days. A forge that glowed like the sun, a hand drawing a ring from blinding fire, a sword cutting the hand and the ring falling. The image was quick, hurtling, as if a trapped bird had been freed and flew too fast to be seen whole. She saw the ring laying like a sliver of moon in the palm of Isildur, but that image smudged and altered and folded back on itself until it was less a single event than a spiral of possibility. The ring wanting, the ring watching, the ring pulling. She could feel the ring's attention in the shards. It was not like the curiosity of a thing. It was a hunger that remembered all the mouths it had fed and all the wars it had begun. The shards showed hosts and kings, quiet thieves and loud emperors, and each reflection whispered a choice that had been made. Then the glances sharpened, and the world became a line threaded with black. It ran from a dark hill to a dark wood. That black thread moved like menacing vines, thickening and knotting. It tugged at images, rewove them. Where it tightened, a shadow deepened. The thread knotted itself toward Dol Guldur. The name came into her head like a bruise. Dol Guldur, the hill where the belly of some great sleeper curled. The shards showed the knot as a living thing, an anchor, sunk into the earth under that fortress. It was as if some great hook had gripped the roots of greenwood and would not let go. From that hook, the ring cast its will outward like a current beneath water. The wraith that had ridden into the pass was only a prow of that current. Destroy that prow, and 10 more would come in the swell. To break the knot would be to do worse and to do better. She could not unsee how the one ring reached, how it tugged loose threads across distant bones and woven fates. Her chest tightened so that breath became work. The wind had fallen away, not a leaf stirred. Even the air seemed to lean toward the shards and listen. She could feel, with the odd clarity of something not entirely her own power, the long tendril of gravitation that a ring of evil could throw out. It would seek a hand. The vision gave her not only what had been, but what might yet be. A small figure moving through Girdwood at night, coming near the hill, a light in that figure's hand. If the current caught that light, a voice would rise and mend the knot to something far worse. There was danger in the seeing. Each shard took from her a little more of the present, a thin smoothing of time like rubbing away the varnish from a painted board. The pieces would fall and cut, and a cut would open memory into wound. She felt the ache in her temples where the shards had hung, as if the sky itself had pressed a thumb into her brow. But alongside the ache rose a clarity, hard and terrible and luminous. The path of the knot ran to Dol Guldur. The choice stood out bright as a brand. She could retreat. She could go back down the hollow road, bury the shards in a stream, and bury herself under the green of ordinary days. The world beyond the pass would still exist. If she fled, men would mend their fences, hobbits would spin their tales, and somewhere the distant small comforts would hold. The ring would still reach, but perhaps its reach would be less now, disappointed and foiled by cunning and by time. That was one road. It was the road most would choose. It was the road that kept hands clean, but let the knot tighten, or she could follow. To follow was to go into the lion's belly, into the dark throat, where the knot found purchase. That meant crossing a line older than fear. It meant stepping into a place where light forgot its name, and where silence gathered like a cloak. There would be no return to ordinary quiet. When she had passed that threshold, the world would feel different against her skin. Friends would not find her unmarked. She would carry back something or else be claimed by the something she pursued. There would be a price, and the price would be known in the slow hunger of nights that never let the senses rest. Her hand closed on a shard. It was cool, and it hummed against her palm like a sleeping insect. A ring of frost spread on the flesh where she touched it, not of cold, but of memory. The shard mirrored her own face, but the face shown was older and lined with strange scars. In the reflection, her eyes were not simple. They had seen circuits of power and maps of ruin. She thought of Will, of his laughter, of the small life she'd left behind. She thought of the faces of those who would never know the day had been kept because she had gone forward and done what none had expected she could do. The road upward peeled away from the green world like a ribbon of old bone. Stones frowned where grass met stone, and beyond the last hedgerow the trees of greenwood leaned together like conspirators. The air tasted of rot and root. The sky above the hills had a thick pall to it, as if someone had drawn a net high and caught the light behind it. From those heights drifted the sound of something enormous breathing slowly under the earth. It was not wind. It was older than that, a slow exhalation of long maliced thought. The shadows pooled and slowed as she stepped nearer. They did not fall, but clung. She could feel the change in her power. When she had pushed the wraith apart, the urge had been like pushing on a door. There in the past, her power had obeyed the shape of her thought and took that shape into being. Now the power answered with a different quality. It gathered like coiled rope rather than a gust of wind, and it listened to everything that breathed the wood. She had to choose how to use that rope. If she pulled too hard, if she sought to shred the knot from without, the world might simply bind itself tighter and switch hands. If she entered and sank her fingers into the skein at its root, she would feel the thing fight in a way that would change her. She took a step. The leaves underfoot made no sound. An owl that had been watching fell silent at once, as if even its bellows were choked by the quiet. The path narrowed, the trees made archways, and the sky became a slit. The shards of black glass along the roadside clinked softly, one to another, as if marking her passage. A gust of wind tried to turn back against her and found its edges snagged on the memory of her having been before, of a hand that had done a fierce and unquiet thing. It broke into a dozen small currents and was spent. Shadows reached across the path like fingers. They did not belong to any visible thing. They were the shade of thought cast before the body that had not yet come. She felt in a quickened pulse beneath the skin of her arms the nearing of watchers. The forest set its teeth and listened. The ring-wound thread hummed underfoot like a barely heard wire. The closer she drew to where the knot anchored itself, the more the air tasted of burned grain and old, cheerless metal, the smell of smithies and the sting of loss. Memory pressed against her like a tide, wanting to drag shoes from her feet. She remembered suddenly the way it had been with Hopper, the slow shuffling of his boots, the way he would look at her with the foolish, exhausted kindness of men who have loved and are afraid. Hopper would not understand what she was about to do. He would tell her to hide and be heroic, which is a bad kind of courage. A hand moved at the back of her mind, a ghost of a caress, and she felt the responsibility like a mantle. If she turned back, the knot would wind tighter. If she went forward, she would enter a place that would make quiet Impossible. Either choice was full of grief. In the pressing of the choice, she discovered a courage no one had asked of her before. It came not as a shout, but as a steady, blunt instrument, the right tool for cutting rope. She added another shard to the circle of light she carried. It gave off a thin, spectral glow, not enough to show the path, but enough to hold her bearings. Through that little cold lamp, she saw a map drawn in the skin of the earth lines of root and river, a ring of hills and a dark blot, where Dol Guldur crouched. The knot showed itself as a knot indeed, no mere metaphor now, but a tangle of shadowed rope that threaded the ground and edged into the fortress's basement, as if taken there to be fastened. Around that knot, small things writhed, lesser shadows, thoughts of men gone wrong, the mutterings of beasts that had been long driven from their nests. They gnawed at the threads. At the edge of the hill the world changed. The air thickened to a texture like old cloth. Birds turned mid-flight and did not finish. Their arc insects dropped from the air as if the sky had suddenly grown heavy. The very sound of the forest grew faint, like a song heard through a wall. She felt an updraft of something like sorrow, sharp and bright and smelling of wildfire. It was a warning, perhaps, and it was also a promise. Whatever lay inside would not be merely a place of evil, but a place where a will had decided to make a home. And any place that chooses to be such a thing must be argued with, or else left to rule. She stepped over a low boundary barely marked, a strip of land where lichens failed to grow. The difference was immediate. Her power felt heavier, as if it had been clothed in wool. The shards in her palm vibrated and showed pictures that did not want to be seen. A lord in shadow, stepping from a throne and making a small sign with his hand, a hobbit's small footfall in a clearing where moonlight mattered a child's toy, spinning in a ruined house. The vision moved faster, the edges burning bright, and then the shards went dark as if someone had turned a lid on a box. No voices called to stop her. No sword rose from a hiding place. The forest merely watched. She understood in the silence that this was not the place of petty ambushes. This was a place that would test the soul as much as the body. There would be no quiet return. If she entered, there would be only the forward press of consequence. Nevertheless, she moved. She gathered her power in the same place she gathered her courage. Not in a wild push this time, but in a slow, deliberate threading of will. She would follow the knot like one following a seam down the belly of a great beast. She pictured the thread as it ran under the hill, and she pictured her hand, small and human and steady, easing in and feeling for the first loose loop. If she found the loop, she would begin to untie. If she could not, she would have to cut, and that would leave ragged ends. That thought tasted like iron and bleeding. With each step, the woods narrowed and the shadows grew teeth. Something watched her from the hollow of a tree. Something older than the shapes of men turned its head and measured her spine. The air hummed with the faint, far-off chant of many voices, so soft it might have been the wind or might have been a litany in the dark. She could have stayed and listened, but listening would not unmake the knot. The choice had been made in the shards when she had shattered the wraith. Now, she only had to follow it to its end. She moved into the lion's belly. The hill swallowed the road, and the forest's edge closed like lips. Behind her, the shards lay scattered, reflecting a sky she would not see again for some time. Ahead, Dol Guldur loomed, not as a fortress of stone only, but as a mouth set in earth and leaf. The knot tugged at her, and she answered by stepping deeper into the darkness that it had drawn, into the place from which there would be no quiet return. Her hand hovered a breath above the thing. The air between her fingers and the blacked surface tasted of burnt iron and old leaves. It shimmered as if water lay there. Around them, the hall breathed, slow, expectant, as if the fortress itself leaned forward to listen. Threads of shadow, slim as braided hair, ran from the object into the floor and from the floor into the walls, and where those cords entered stone, the runes drank light and kept it. She felt the pressure of those cords in the quiet of her skull, as if strings wound round some inner wheel and tugged at her thoughts. When she drew the force, she knew it came not as a hand, but as a tide. It rose from the soles of her feet, from the hollow in her throat, from the small, stubborn place where a child keeps a secret prayer. She gathered it slow, the way one takes a cup to a well, and the dark chords answered by tightening and humming like a hive. Each note of that hum showed her a memory like a pane of glass, laughter spilling over a fence, a name written in dust, the tang of bread still warm. Each time a cord slithered free, the memory cracked and slid through her as if through a window, leaving only the sense of warm wood and a hollow where the word should have been. The first pull came easily enough. She let the tide go out, and the nearest braid recoiled, breaking its hold on the masonry with a sound like ropes parting at sea. A small relief spread through the hall. The air brightened as if someone had opened a shutter, and something that had been mute began to laugh in the distance. It was not the whole of the song, it was one bright note, a child's peal, and it made the stones remember how sound should be. But with that note gone from the fortress, a name slipped from her mind like a pebble from a pocket. For a moment, she could not place the face that belonged to that syllable. The absence made her chest feel raw. The object resisted then with a thing more cunning than strength. It did not pull back so much as it welcomed, and in that welcome there was appetite. The hunger had no voice at first. It was a pulling at the edges of perception, a hollowing where images once sat. When she tried to close the gap, the hunger offered a bargain. Leave the weave whole and keep what you are, or break it and take this thing into yourself. Her mind, half a tentacle of thought, recoiled in the mapping of choices. She felt its logic like cold water, guardian or prisoner shield outward or shackle within. The words were not there, but the shape of the decision pressed against her sternum like a hand. She thought of things too small to sound heroic. A kettle's half-cool steam, the pattern of knots on a blanket, a laugh that began with a letter that now floated empty inside her. These were the prices that slipped away with each thread she loosed, and in that reckoning she found a different dread. To be guardian meant to keep the dark at bay, to stand between shadow and the land, but to be guardian meant also to be the place where shadow lay down its weight. Sometimes protection in this world had the smell of sacrifice. She stood, counting those small things, and felt her fingers tighten, not on stone, but on memory. Her will had muscle, and the muscle flexed. She reached again, not with hand, but with the bright pull she had learned to steward, and the bonds came with a slowness that set sparks along her temples. When the second braid parted, the sound was like breath, released a corridor that had been black as a mouth, filled instead with a cold blue gleam. Dust motes began to turn on themselves as if music had been set under them. The fortress hunger recoiled, leaving the air less thick. But in her own head, a song's last line dissolved. She tried to pin that line back with thought, to press the water back into the cup, but the line would not lay down again. It fluttered away like a bird gone through an open door. With each freed thread, the thing at the center shifted its weight. Once it had been a knot, a woven canon of shadow, now it became a center of gravity. Threads reached like arms for her, not to drag her, but to braid into her. She felt them nest about the edges of her will, curious and intent. The sensation was intimate and awful, like cold tongues of wind licking along a wound. They tasted of the same things that the fortress had peeled from her: names, laughter, the small domestic smells of another life. And in tasting them they learned. That learning made the hunger more articulate. It began to form notions about keeping, about tending, about needing. The thought that rose then was simple and absolute. If she took it in, she could unmake the weave entirely. The idea settled in her like a promise or a trap. To wrench the object free would unbind the cords and unravel the knot that held this place to its hunger. The land beyond the gate would breathe again, but the thing itself would not be destroyed. It would cinch itself to her will like a parasite learning to live under skin. She would gain its vast appetite as a tool. Her hands would hold power that could keep the shadow from spilling outward, but that power would come with a companion, an intelligence greedy and cold that would make her watchful, alone, and forever bound to the border it kept. She tested the edge of that future like one tests a knife with a finger. A vision came. Fields unblighted, birds returning to the wood that had not seen wing for years, a river bright as a mirror. Another vision slid in behind it, darker. A figure on a lonely mound at midnight, hands black with the work of binding, dreams full of other people's ruined faces. The two images hooked together and would not unhook. To choose the bright future was to take the darker one as toll. Her pulse pushed against the decision like a fist against a wall. The fortress answered her indecision with shutters that ran along the walls. Where the cords had thinned, the stone sealed itself like a wound contracting. Shadows pooled and tried to reform the braid. The hunger grew impatient. It whispered in the place where language almost lives, and when it whispered, she felt the whisper on her tongue as a remembered taste. It offered her this framing: hold me, and you will be both sword and door. Preserve us, and you will be sacrificed to the task. The words were not quite words, but they made sense with a terrifying clarity. She knew then that the choice would not be deferred by hesitation. The weave would not wait while she gathered courage. She gathered courage anyway. She let the tide come to her like a returning tide that must, by law of sea, fill what was emptied. With a movement that was both will and storm, she tried to take the object bodily. No mere yank at the threads, but an attempt to seize the center and carry it out of itself. The artifact tightened its mouth like an animal sensing a hand, and for a heartbeat she felt the worst of the bargain, a memory stolen not by the fortress, but by the thing itself. It pushed into her mind like ice water, sliding over the images, replacing them with a black horizon. The memory of a hand that once held hers dissolved into the shape of a knot. She recoiled, as one recoils from a blow, but the recoil did not free her. She had been marked now by contact. That mark made her power taste different. Telekinesis, once a bright, clean force, became tactile and hungry. It felt not like cold light, but like fingers clad in dusk. When she moved the air, it resisted with a memory of its own, and sometimes it answered a desire before she formed it. The sensation was a betrayal born on a higher scale. Her own will was learning to wear another stride. She could feel the beginnings of a pattern laid under her thoughts. Check this way. Open that slot. Keep this place closed until the hunger speaks. She fought that pattern with every memory she had left, clutching to small, fierce images as if to keep them pinned inside. Outside, the freed threads had already begun to do their work. Where one braid had gone, a small thing mended itself. An old statue eased its shoulders. A weed found sunlight. Sounds slid back into the world like water released from a bottle. The fortress was answering as if relieved. But relief, she understood, was a debtor. It asked for payment and would not forgive late. The knot pulsed in the middle of the room like a heart. Its beat matched to her own, and with every beat, her mind felt a little more open. She felt the hunger reaching fingers into the spaces between thoughts, laying down roots and names for itself. She made her decision as the stone under her feet began to sing, a low chord that ran through bone and marrow. To leave the weave in place would doom the land to slow rot. To take it was to be remade. She had no great claim to heroism, no lofty vow that could not be broken, only the stubbornness of one who had already lost things and would not see others lose more. Her hand, the hand that had sent shivering walls into flight earlier, clenched. The will she gathered felt like a thing borrowed from winter. She threw it toward the knot, not to pluck a thread, but to wrench the center free. The contact came like a sternum split. The object answered her by pouring itself into the channel she had opened. The hunger uncoiled and slid, patient as smoke, toward the anchor she offered. For an instant, she felt whole and hollow at once. The room went silent except for the thudding of a foreign heart inside her. She had made the knot know her name, and the knot had begun to learn her shape. As the weave unspooled around them and light edged the doorway, her mind felt the first true fingers of that hunger curl under her own. She could still pull back. She could let the thing fall and let someone else close the ruin's wounds. She could refuse the binding and walk away with what remained of her life. Instead, she tightened her will and pulled, and at the moment the artifact answered with a sound like a throat clearing in the dark. She felt the first graft take and tasted, sharp as a coin, the price to come. Shards of the knot sang as they fell, not like glass, but like the breaking of a long silence. The sound cut the black like a blade, a high, keening note that made the very air sting. For an instant, all things held their breath. Hoofs, wings, the rustle of leaves made brittle by shadow. Then the darkness itself began to strip away, as if an enormous cloak were being tugged free from the land. It slid from stone and root, unthreading with a noise like old rope snapping. And where it left bare things, they shuddered and sobbed light back into being. The Nazgul faltered first. They were not undone. They could not be so easily sundered. But their leaden tread grew uncertain. The thin keening that had once sounded from them, like wind in a ruined steeple, broke into stuttering calls. Cloaks that had hung like holes in the world filled for an instant with the suggestion of shoulders, and then the suggestion went. One of them reeled as though a wound had been struck at its heart. Its steed whinnied, a sound like metal on stone, and slid away, leaving hoof prints that steamed in the returning cold. Others lifted their heads and peered at the sky, uncertain and blind to a light they had not measured before. Around the stone, where the knot lay smashed, The ground was bare of shadow. It withdrew from the undergrowth as a tide draws back, leaving moss and fern quivering in the first pale fingers of dawn. Pale green returned to the lichens. The smell of wet earth leaked back into the valley, peat and root and the old sweetness of sap, and with it came the small voices of animals. A thrush dared to test the morning with one bright note, then another, until a chain of song rose where silence had reigned. The watchers on the ridge, those who had kept their lamps lit against the long night, lowered their hands and let out a laugh that had the tremble of pent-up fear. She stood among the shards, the child whose hands had broken what no blade could touch. Her palms were cut, but the blood was not what marked her now. In the broken teeth of that thing lay a remnant, a curled thread no larger than a hair, and it lay where her fingers had pressed with all the hunger of her will. The remnant did not glow, it did not move, yet it was a weight that sat at the root of her throat like a small stone. When she tried to sing, an old habit learned in a careless green morning, no sound came. Her lips shaped the tune, a simple, wordless thing that had often woken the rooks and soothed the village dogs. But the sound died before it reached the air. Her throat closed as if tightened by a slow hand. She put a trembling palm there and found cold, not cold like ice, but the cold of deep iron buried in the earth. The child's eyes filled not with the hot, quick salt of a new wound, but with a mute, astonished sorrow that was almost dawning into stubborn purpose. Those about her saw the change and understood, even the folk who knew nothing of lore and binding. The elder, who had once mended plows with more patience than prayer, said then, very small, she has taken a piece for us. A ranger, whose cloak was threaded with years of watching, let his mouth tighten. No one rejoiced wholly. The saving of many held a cost they could name and could feel. Mothers gathered their little ones close, not from fear of the thing in her hands, but from a new reverence that made them uncertain how to behave. In the days that followed, the valley breathed once more. Roads that had been closed opened like a fist uncurling. People came with instruments and mugs and questions. They carried the news beyond the hills to the keepers of the passes and the men who held watch by ruined towers. Fires were banked down elsewhere. The clamor of an engine of war lost a cog. The Nazgul's influence, which had been a pressure that made men speak in half-closed mouths and signed secret oaths, slackened along the borders. Outposts that had not dared lift their banners let small pennons flutter. In a dozen places where silence had grown into a disease, life reclaimed a room. Yet not all was mended. The knots unweaving had not been a cleansing so much as a tearing. Threads of dark had been forced loose, and one had wedged itself into the child's marrow. It was small, cunning as a lodged fishbone, and it shaped itself to her breath. In dreams it unrolled like a map, revealing places of long night and wells of cold, and for a day she woke with the taste of iron and salt on her tongue. Sunlight warmed her skin, but some part of her remained shaded. She could feel sometimes the tug of that lodged thread when others were near some old hurt or secret it tightened, like a string pulled taut. Her power answered to the change, and answered differently. Where once her telekinesis had leapt and danced with the easy joy of a child's game, now it moved with a measured reserve. Stones obeyed, but with a reluctant shiver. She could lift a cart, but not the weight of a fallen wall without the thread's whisper in her ear, and that whisper asked for things she would not always grant. It taught her to hesitate, to judge every exertion as though any sudden motion might wake what lay under her ribs. At night, the stars seemed to look at her with a new impartiality. The moon made a careful circle as if to keep a safe distance. People saw this restraint as a virtue. Elders spoke of balance, of sacrifice. Bards changed their verses. Where once they would have called her a child of sudden miracle, they now named her with two words, shielder and warder. Those titles sat awkwardly on a small frame. Children, awkward with the new rule of awe, came less often. They were kinder. In their way, they left a stick for a sword, a crust of bread at the edge of the common green. The child's smile had altered, but she learned to accept the offerings like a creature learning the rules of grief. Sometimes at dusk, she walked alone to the edge of the basin where the shadow had been the thickest. Stones there were blackened still, not by fire, but by the memory of absence. She would set her hand upon them and send out a small, testing wave. The lodged dark answered with a coldness like old iron and the echo of voices that were not quite speech. They spoke in the manner of wounds, half words that carried memory and hunger, both. She did not fear them as she once would have, but neither did she invite them. She listened, learning the cadences of their wants and laying them aside like fragile dishes. A ranger knelt with her once at that place. He had watched the long night, and his face had been carved by hard-sent lines. He did not call her child or miracle. He called her by the name the valley had long used in whispers. The road you must walk is not for the many, he said, and his voice was an old, weathered thing. It will be solitary and sharp. You will stand where winds gather and hold them back. Be ready. He offered no counsel for the quiet that had come into her voice. She thought of what that would mean, to be the bulwark between a valley and the sweep of returning dark was to be a thing apart. People would come with thanks, with songs, with the weight of gratitude that grows heavy over time. They would lean, perhaps too heavily, on the one who had paid, in silence. She saw that now. The kindling of a shrine in a corner of the green, the slow commerce of devotion. She did not reject it. She knew balance demanded a shape. Beyond the valley, the shifting of the knot altered alliances and ambitions. Men who had pressed at the borders with furtive greed found their hopes chilled. A lieutenant who had hoped to seize a pass for his lord found his scouts returning with tales of cracked banners and burned reaches. A wise woman in a tower far south wrote a single line in a letter and sealed it tight. There has been rent in the long weave. The line did not say which party would profit or whether profit was now possible. The world was a wheel, and one small cog had been changed. How the turning would answer was for seasons to declare. In the valley itself, the immediate future carved its path. The child, the shielder, learned to craft small wards, simple and crude at first, to keep the lodged dark from slipping into ruinous mischief. She braided iron and ash with a careful hand, took counsel from the elder smith who had taught her how to mend a plowshare, and she learned the patience of making something that would endure. Her teaching was slow and steady, and it was not heroism so much as persistence. People came to help, to fetch charcoal and to hold a lantern, and in their faces there was a new agreement that some burdens belonged not just to one. Yet the lodged darkness had its own cunning. Once, at the hour when the valley air is thin and bees hum low, she dreamed of a road beyond the passes. The road sloped into a land of dark pines and silent domes. Along it walked figures she knew from stories, rangers, stooped men, and women with eyes like flint. They wore no crowns. They wore the look of those who have kept watch for long winters. In the dream, she was among them, not as equal, but as a thing placed there to hold a fisher. Someone handed her a cloak lined with a dark gray wool. It was not to hide her, the dream suggested, but to mark that she must stand on the line where light and shadow meet. When she woke, she found that the lodge had left a taste of iron at the back of her mouth. She rose and packed a few things: bread, a small coil of cord, the battered cloak she had once used for play. She did not tell the valley that she intended to go beyond the nearest ridge. She did not say it aloud, because saying it would make it a petition, and she was not asking. Instead, she walked to the pass at dusk and stood with one hand on the stones that had once bound the knot. The Nazgul might mend their step, might gather again under some other master. The world had shifted enough that they would not find easy purchase here, but their hunger was old. She felt it now as a possibility, a thread that might catch once more. To prevent that, to keep the valley's breath unburdened, she must learn to bear the lodged dark without being consumed by it. She must temper it, teach it the law of restraint. So she turned her face to the west, where the road rose and the first tall firs began. The sky stained itself with the last amber of day. Wolves lifted their heads and then returned to scent. Behind her, the valley's fires were small and steady. Before her, the pass breathed cold and alien, as if inviting a truth. She took her first step, not as a child running to play, but as a ward taking her post. The road would be long. The lodged dark would teach her bitter lessons. Yet in her chest there remained a thin, unbroken thing, an ember of mercy, not a song, but a promise to keep what she had saved. She walked on into the dusking, into the gray between things, and the land watched her go with a careful, hopeful silence.